Hannah and I were the couple everyone envied. Friends would often say, "You two are proof that real love still exists." At the time, I believed it. We'd been married for 10 years, built a life we were proud of, and had two amazing kids who brought joy to every corner of our home. Emma, our bright and bubbly 8-year-old, had my knack for adventure, and Jake, at 5, had inherited Hannah's love for puzzles and stories. They were our world, and together we felt like we were living the dream. I worked as a contractor, building homes and businesses from the ground up. I loved my work, not just for the satisfaction of seeing something tangible come to life, but for what it allowed me to provide for my family. Meanwhile, Hannah ran a small home business selling handmade crafts online. It gave her the flexibility to be there for Emma and Jake while still pursuing something she loved. We made a good team, her creativity balancing my practicality, her warmth complementing my steady demeanor. Every Friday was sacred to us. Family movie night. It didn't matter how busy the week had been or how tired we were. Friday evenings were untouchable. We'd pile onto the couch with popcorn and blankets, arguing over whether to watch an animated comedy for the kids or an action movie that would keep Jake entertained but inevitably make Emma groan. Those nights were filled with laughter, love, and a sense of unity that made me feel like the luckiest man alive. But looking back, I realize now that even in those perfect moments, the cracks were already forming. Subtle at first, like hairline fractures in a foundation that had once seemed unshakable. I'd brush them off, convincing myself that every marriage has its ups and downs. After all, we were solid, weren't we? Hannah's laughter, the way she'd rest her head on my shoulder during the movie, the way the kids would snuggle between us. How could anything be wrong? I should have paid more attention. There were signs, but I missed them. Or maybe I chose to ignore them. The occasional distracted look in Hannah's eyes, the times she'd forget about our plans and apologize with an absent-minded smile, the way she seemed to retreat into herself when she thought no one was watching. I chalked it up to stress. Running a business, managing the household, being a mom, it wasn't easy. And I was busy too, with long hours at work and projects that sometimes spilled into the weekends. One night, as we sat together after the kids had gone to bed, I told her how much I appreciated her. "You're the glue that holds us together," I said, wrapping an arm around her. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks," she replied, her voice soft. Then she quickly changed the subject, asking about my latest project. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, that moment plays on a loop in my mind. What was she thinking? Was she already pulling away? The thing about cracks is that they don't always start with a loud bang or a dramatic event. Sometimes they're quiet, subtle. You don't notice them until it's too late, until the foundation starts to crumble and you're left wondering how you missed it. I didn't know it then, but the life I thought was perfect was already beginning to shift beneath my feet. And no matter how much I tried to hold on, to keep us together, there was a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. One that would test everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. Hannah was always ambitious. It was one of the things I loved most about her, the way she poured her energy into everything she did. So, when she started taking on more freelance work to grow her business, I didn't just support her. I encouraged her. I was proud of her determination, her drive to make something of her own while still being an amazing mom to Emma and Jake. But then Jack entered our lives. At first, he was just a name she mentioned casually in conversation. "I landed a big client today," she said one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. "His name's Jack, owns a chain of retail stores, and wants me to design some custom pieces for his outlets." "That's great," I replied, genuinely happy for her. "Sounds like a big opportunity." "It is," she said, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. "He's really impressed with my work." I didn't think much of it at the time. Hannah's excitement was infectious, and I wanted to share in her joy. But over the next few weeks, Jack's name started coming up more often. He wasn't just a client anymore. He was a topic of conversation. She'd tell me about their meetings, the projects they were working on, even little jokes he made that she found hilarious. At first, I chalked it up to professional enthusiasm. Jack was her biggest client, after all, and his business could take hers to new heights. But then, the late-night phone calls began. She'd step out of the room, her voice low, her laughter quiet but distinct. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd wave it off. "Just Jack," she'd say, as if it were no big deal. But it felt like a big deal. My gut told me something was off, even though I couldn't put my finger on it. Hannah wasn't the kind of person to hide things, but there was a new guardedness about her that I couldn't ignore. She started dressing up more, even for casual outings, things like grocery runs or dropping off packages. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the counter or the coffee table, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse, on silent. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that I was overthinking, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. One night, as we lay in bed, I decided to bring it up. "Hannah," I began, my voice careful, "you've been working really hard lately. Is everything okay?" She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know," I said, trying to choose my words carefully. "You just seem different. Busier. Distracted." She laughed softly, brushing off my concerns. "You're imagining things. Work's just been a lot lately. Jack's a perfectionist, and he's keeping me on my toes." The mention of his name made my stomach twist, but I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't want to come across as insecure or controlling. Hannah had always been her own person, and I respected that. Still, the doubts lingered. It wasn't just the late-night calls or the way she clung to her phone. It was the subtle changes in her demeanor, the way she seemed to drift away during family time. Even the kids noticed it. One evening, while we were watching a movie, Emma asked, "Why isn't Mommy laughing at the funny parts?" I glanced at Hannah, who was staring at her phone, her expression distant. "She's just tired, sweetheart," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The more I tried to ignore the signs, the louder they became. Hannah's enthusiasm for her work seemed to bleed into every aspect of her life, except for us. She was always rushing off to meetings, always preoccupied. When she was home, she wasn't really there. I started to feel like an outsider in my own marriage, like there was a part of her life I no longer had access to. And the more I thought about it, the more Jack's name became a thorn in my side. Who was this man? What was his hold on her? Was I being paranoid? Or was there something more? As the weeks went on, the distance between us grew. I tried to bridge the gap, to reconnect with her, but it felt like I was grasping at air. She was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. I wish I'd confronted her instead of letting my doubts fester. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my children, could be keeping something from me. And yet, deep down, I knew. The cracks in our foundation were no longer invisible. They were widening, threatening to bring everything we'd built crashing down. Hannah's behavior became impossible to ignore. The changes were subtle at first, shifts I could explain away if I tried hard enough. But as the weeks passed, they piled up, each one heavier than the last, until they were impossible to dismiss. Her morning routines, for one, took on a different energy. She used to throw her hair into a messy bun and throw on jeans and a sweatshirt before taking Emma and Jake to school. Now, she'd spend extra time in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup and choosing outfits that accentuated her figure. When I teased her about it one morning, she laughed it off. "It's just nice to feel good about myself," she said. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that this was just a phase, a harmless boost of confidence. But the growing knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Her phone became another red flag. It was always on silent now, never far from her hand. If it buzzed or lit up, she'd glance at it quickly, a flicker of tension crossing her face before she put it away. I couldn't remember the last time her phone wasn't locked with a new passcode I didn't know. I tried to brush it off, rationalizing that she deserved her privacy. But the secrecy around it wasn't normal. Once, while we were sitting on the couch, I leaned over to glance at her screen, casually curious about what had her so engrossed. She tilted the phone away instinctively, her movements too quick to be innocent. "Work emails," she said with a tight smile. I didn't press her, but the moment lingered in my mind long after she'd gone to bed. Family time became strained. Hannah used to be the first one to suggest outings, picnics at the park, trips to the zoo, or simply baking cookies with Emma and Jake in the kitchen. Now, she seemed distracted during these moments, her mind elsewhere. One Sunday, we went to the lake for a picnic. It was one of our favorite spots, a place where we'd spent countless afternoons laughing and playing with the kids. But this time, Hannah spent half the trip on her phone, walking away from us to take calls. I finally confronted her that evening. As we stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. "Hannah," I began, my tone careful but firm, "is everything okay? You've been distant lately." She barely glanced up from the dishes, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "You've been distracted," I said. "Dressing up more, always on your phone, stepping away during family time. It's like you're somewhere else." She let out a small laugh, but it felt forced. "You're imagining things. Work's just been busy, that's all. Jack's demanding, and I'm trying to keep up." There it was again. Jack. His name had become a thorn in my side, a reminder of something I couldn't quite prove but couldn't ignore. I wanted to believe her, to trust that the woman I loved would never betray me. But the cracks in her story were as glaring as the cracks in our marriage. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed our conversation over and over. Her laugh, the way she avoided my gaze, the way she mentioned Jack without hesitation. It all felt calculated, like she was trying too hard to convince me there was nothing wrong. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. The tipping point came a few days later. I was helping Emma with her homework when Hannah walked into the room, dressed in a sleek black dress and heels. She looked stunning, but it wasn't her usual style. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Networking event," she said, grabbing her purse. "Jack invited me. It's a big deal for my business." "On a Wednesday night?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, just for a moment, before flashing me a smile. "It's important, okay? I'll be back late, so don't wait up." I watched her leave, a mix of anger and unease bubbling in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. After putting the kids to bed, I sat in the quiet living room, staring at my hands. I needed answers. I needed to know if my suspicions were just paranoia, or if the woman I loved was hiding something. The next day, I found myself searching for clues, for anything that would confirm or deny the growing suspicion in my heart. I checked her calendar, her email, even glanced at her receipts. But she was careful, too careful. If she was hiding something, she was doing a damn good job. Still, my gut wouldn't let it go. The distance between us had grown into a chasm, and every interaction felt like a performance. She'd smile, laugh, kiss me goodbye, but it all felt hollow. The warmth that had once defined our relationship was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. Deep down, I knew the truth. The red flags were all there, waving boldly in front of me. But I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. I clung to the hope that I was wrong, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But hope is a fragile thing, and it wouldn't be long before it shattered completely. Hannah was in the shower when it happened. Her phone, which she normally guarded like a dragon protecting treasure, was left on the kitchen counter. It was face down, silent as usual, but a notification lit up the screen as I passed by. I didn't intend to look. I wanted to be the husband who trusted his wife, who didn't pry or jump to conclusions. But the message stopped me in my tracks. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, babe. I'll bring the whiskey winking face, Jack." My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together as my heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the confirmation I didn't want but couldn't ignore. The gut feeling I'd been pushing aside for weeks had been right all along. I picked up her phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. She hadn't changed her passcode since the last time I'd used it, back when everything was still normal between us. The messages were there, glaring and undeniable. Flirty texts, inside jokes, photos of the two of them, smiling together in ways I hadn't seen her smile with me in months. And then there were the plans, detailed conversations about meeting at hotels, nights spent together when she was supposedly networking or working late. It wasn't just an affair. It was a full-blown betrayal, woven into the fabric of her life while I'd been too blind, or too trusting, to see it. The sound of the shower turning off snapped me out of my daze. I quickly placed her phone back on the counter and stepped back, my mind racing. What was I going to say? How could I confront her without losing my temper? My hands clenched into fists at my sides as I heard her footsteps approaching. She entered the kitchen in her robe, her hair damp and her expression relaxed, completely unaware that her world was about to change. "Hannah," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "We need to talk." She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What about?" I gestured toward her phone. "About Jack." Her face drained of color, and for a moment, I saw the panic flicker in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, crossing her arms defensively. "What about him?" "I saw the message," I said evenly. "And I saw the others. The photos. The plans. I know everything, Hannah." Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to deny it, but couldn't find the words. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and sat down at the table, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not good enough," I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Then why did it? Why did you lie to me, to our kids, and betray everything we've built?" She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. I was unhappy. I felt stuck. Jack made me feel alive again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. "You felt stuck? And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix it, you ran to him?" "I didn't plan it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It just happened." "That's a lie," I said coldly. "You planned every hotel meeting, every secret text, every excuse to leave this house and spend time with him. Don't you dare tell me it just happened." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, but I felt no sympathy. Not yet. I was too raw, too angry, too betrayed to comfort her. The woman I'd loved for 10 years, the mother of my children, had torn our family apart for what? A thrill? A man who wasn't me? The kids' laughter from the living room broke the tension, reminding us both of what was at stake. I lowered my voice, my tone sharp and controlled. "We'll talk about this later. Right now, I need to think." I walked out of the kitchen, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The life I thought was perfect was gone, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving reality. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Hannah's confession were a blur of tension and heartbreak. I'd always imagined betrayal would bring a clean break, a single moment of rage or sorrow, followed by clarity. But the reality was messy. It lingered, seeping into every corner of our lives, turning even mundane moments into painful reminders of what she'd done. Hannah apologized constantly in those first few days. Her words were frantic, desperate. "I'm so sorry," she'd say, over and over, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen." At first, I listened. Part of me even wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could salvage our marriage for the sake of Emma and Jake. But every time I looked at her, all I could see were the texts, the photos, the lies. The trust we'd built over 10 years was gone, shattered in an instant. I confronted her about Jack, about the promises she'd made to end the affair. "If you're serious about fixing this," I said one night, my voice cold and steady, "you need to cut him off. Completely." She nodded, her expression filled with guilt. "I will. I promise." But promises are fragile things. A few days later, I saw her phone light up with his name again. I didn't even have to look at the message to know what it was. The fact that she still hadn't blocked him was proof enough. My blood boiled as I confronted her. "I thought you said it was over," I demanded, holding her phone out like evidence in a courtroom. "I'm trying," she stammered, her face pale. "It's just complicated." "It's not complicated, Hannah," I said, my voice rising. "You either want to save this marriage, or you don't." Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't ready to let go of him. Not yet, maybe not ever. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. How could I fight for us when she wasn't willing to do the same? The kids began to notice the cracks in our home. Emma, always perceptive, asked me one night, "Daddy, why is Mommy crying all the time? Did something bad happen?" I knelt down to her level, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Mommy and I are just having a hard time right now," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But we both love you, and Jake more than anything. Don't ever forget that." She nodded, her wide eyes filled with worry. "I love you too," she whispered, throwing her arms around my neck. I held her tightly, my heart breaking all over again. Family movie nights became strained. Hannah and I would sit on opposite ends of the couch, the kids between us, oblivious to the silent war raging in our marriage. Every laugh, every smile, felt forced, like we were actors playing roles we no longer believed in. I hated it. I hated pretending everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. One night, after the kids were in bed, I told Hannah I needed space. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "We need to figure out where we're going. Because right now, we're just spinning in circles." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Just tell me how to fix this." But her actions didn't match her words. She kept seeing Jack, despite her promises to end things. Each lie, each betrayal, chipped away at what little hope I had left. It was like trying to hold water in my hands. No matter how tightly I gripped, it kept slipping through. One evening, I came home to find Hannah sitting at the dining table, her head in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, her face pale and drawn. "I told him it's over," she said quietly. "For real this time." I didn't respond right away. I wanted to believe her, but I'd heard it before. "We'll see," I said finally, walking past her to check on the kids. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had we gotten here? How had the life we'd built together fallen apart so quickly? I thought about Emma and Jake, about the future they deserved. Could I give them that if I stayed with Hannah? Could I give it to them if I left? The answers didn't come easily. All I knew was that the woman lying beside me, the woman I'd once trusted with my whole heart, was now a stranger. And no amount of apologies could change that. Friday nights used to be sacred, family movie night. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of connection. But this Friday was different. Hannah was distracted, her eyes darting toward her phone every few minutes. She tried to hide it, but I noticed. Of course, I noticed. She was sitting there, physically present but emotionally somewhere else, and I was at my breaking point. We were halfway through the movie when the doorbell rang. Jake perked up, his little voice cheerful. "Is it pizza, Daddy?" I frowned, confused. We hadn't ordered anything. Hannah froze, her face losing color, and my stomach churned. Something was wrong. I stood, brushing popcorn off my jeans, and went to the door. When I opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Jack. He was standing there, dressed in a fitted blazer and jeans, holding a bottle of whiskey like it was some kind of housewarming gift. The audacity of it all hit me like a freight train. His smirk was confident, arrogant even, and it was clear he'd come here for a reason. "Evening," he said, stepping forward like he was about to walk past me into my house. I blocked the doorway, my hands gripping the frame so hard my knuckles turned white. "What the hell are you doing here?" I growled, my voice low and steady. Hannah appeared behind me, her voice shaky. "Jack, what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" Jack repeated, his smirk widening. "I'm here to settle things, to make it clear where we all stand." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You're not stepping one foot inside this house." "Why not?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I'm already a part of your life. Let's stop pretending otherwise." Emma and Jake peeked around the corner, their curious faces peeking out from behind the couch. Hannah turned to them, her voice sharp. "Kids, go to your room." Emma hesitated, her brows furrowed in confusion. "But Mommy." "Go," she repeated, more firmly this time. The kids exchanged nervous glances before retreating down the hall. My chest tightened as I heard their bedroom door close. They didn't deserve this. None of us did. Jack held up the bottle of whiskey, shaking it lightly as if to make a point. Thought we could have a drink. Talk like men. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, and in one swift motion, he opened the bottle and poured the whiskey over my head. The liquid stung my eyes, the strong smell burning my nostrils. I stumbled back, momentarily blinded, as Jack leaned in close. "I'm the man of the house now," he sneered, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Why don't you pack your bags and leave?" The rage that boiled inside me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. My hands clenched into fists, every muscle in my body screaming to strike back. But I held my ground, my breaths heavy and labored as I wiped the whiskey from my face. Hannah stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't say a word, didn't even move to stop him. That hurt more than anything Jack could have said or done. Her silence was a betrayal all its own. "You're going to regret this," I said finally, my voice calm despite the fire raging inside me. Jack laughed, a smug, infuriating sound that echoed in my ears as he turned to leave. "We'll see about that," he called over his shoulder, swaggering down the driveway like he owned the world. I watched him go, my mind spinning. My family was falling apart, and this man had the nerve to show up at my house, to taunt me in front of my wife and children. Something had to give. Something had to change. I wasn't about to let him take everything from me. I turned to Hannah, who was still standing there, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked, my voice raw. "This?" She didn't answer. Her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. That was all the confirmation I needed. Without another word, I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of what we once had. As I got into my truck, my hands gripping the wheel, I felt a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The whiskey burned my skin, but the sting in my eyes was nothing compared to the fire in my chest. I sat in my truck, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Jack's smug grin, his arrogant words, replayed in my mind like a broken record. "I'm the man of the house now." The audacity of it made my blood boil. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my family, my kids, my dignity. I wasn't going to let him waltz into my home and take everything I'd built. Not without a fight. I backed out of the driveway, my vision still blurry, but my mind was razor sharp. I didn't go far, just a few houses down the street where I could park out of sight. I needed time to think, to calm down. But the rage was too strong. My thoughts spiraled, one after another, until they all landed on the same conclusion. Jack needed to understand he wasn't untouchable. I waited. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the truck, watching the house from the shadows. The lights in the living room were still on, but the laughter and warmth that once filled that space were gone. I could only imagine the conversation happening inside, if there was one at all. Did Hannah realize what she had done? Did she understand the damage she'd caused? Or was she too wrapped up in Jack's lies to care? Finally, the front door opened. Jack stepped out, his cocky swagger still intact. He adjusted his blazer, glanced around like he owned the place, and started toward his car parked on the street. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The sound made him pause, his head snapping toward my truck. Our eyes met through the windshield, and for the first time, I saw something other than arrogance on his face. Was it fear? Uncertainty? It didn't matter. I wasn't about to back down. I revved the engine, the headlights flooding the street, illuminating his startled expression. He took a step back, raising his hands as if to say, "Calm down." But there was no calming down. Not after everything he'd done. I didn't floor it. I wasn't trying to kill the guy. But I did accelerate enough to send a clear message. Jack tried to move, but the truck clipped him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement with a loud thud. He screamed, clutching his leg, writhing in pain as neighbors began to pour out of their houses. I stepped out of the truck, my heart pounding, but my face calm. The adrenaline coursing through me drowned out the murmurs of the growing crowd. Someone was calling an ambulance, their voice frantic in the background, but my focus was on Jack. He looked up at me, his face pale and twisted in agony. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made him look smaller than he ever had before. You're crazy, he spat through gritted teeth. No, I said, my voice steady. I'm a husband, a father, and I'm done letting you take what's mine. Hannah ran out of the house then, her face a mask of horror. She dropped to her knees beside Jack, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to assess the damage. What have you done? She screamed, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. I protected my family. The paramedics arrived quickly, pushing through the crowd to reach Jack. I stepped aside, letting them do their work. The neighbors whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between me and the scene unfolding on the pavement. I could feel their judgment, their confusion, but I didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. They hadn't lived my life. They hadn't seen the cracks in their own home deepen until someone else forced them apart. The police arrived next, their flashing lights painting the street in shades of blue and red. An officer approached me, his tone calm but firm. Sir, we need to ask you some questions. I nodded, raising my hands slightly. I'm not going anywhere. As they led me to the side of the street, I glanced back at Hannah. She was still crouched beside Jack, her face buried in her hands. The realization of what she'd done, what she'd allowed, seemed to hit her all at once. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't over. There would be questions, consequences. But Jack wasn't invincible anymore. His arrogance had been shattered, and Hannah would have to face the fallout of her choices. As the officers asked their questions, I answered calmly, knowing I'd done what needed to be done. The fight for my family wasn't over, but I'd made my stand. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for certain. Jack wouldn't be back. I sat in the back of my truck, the cool night air biting at my skin as I watched the chaos unfold. Paramedics loaded Jack onto a stretcher, his screams of pain cutting through the murmurs of the gathered neighbors. Flashing lights from the police cruisers painted the scene in shades of blue and red, a surreal backdrop to the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. The officers questioned me, their faces neutral but firm. I told them the truth, or at least the version of it that mattered. Jack had provoked me, threatened my family, and escalated the situation. I didn't mean to hurt him, I said, my voice calm but resolute. I was defending what's mine. Neighbors chimed in, corroborating my story. They'd heard Jack's taunts, seen his arrogant demeanor as he strutted into my home uninvited. One older man, a retired Army veteran, spoke up louder than the rest. That punk got what he deserved, he said gruffly, his arms crossed over his chest. You don't mess with another man's family. The officers eventually let me go, but the tension didn't dissipate. I walked back to the house, my steps heavy, the weight of the night pressing down on me. Hannah was inside, sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. The kids were upstairs, thankfully oblivious to the worst of it. I could hear their faint voices through the ceiling, Emma reading a bedtime story to Jake, a small comfort in the midst of the storm. Hannah looked up as I entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. What have you done? She whispered, her voice trembling. I did what I had to, I replied, my tone sharp but controlled. You let this man walk into our lives, into our home, and tear us apart. I wasn't going to stand by and let him destroy everything. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't want this. I never wanted any of this. Then why didn't you stop it? I shot back, the anger bubbling to the surface. Why didn't you end it when you had the chance? You chose him over us, over our family. Her silence was deafening. She couldn't deny it because we both knew the truth. Jack hadn't just been a mistake. He'd been a choice, one she'd made again and again, despite the damage it caused. I'm sorry, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to fix it. It's too late for sorry, I said, my tone heavy with finality. You broke something that can't be fixed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt colder than it ever had before, the warmth and laughter that once filled it now a distant memory. I thought about Emma and Jake, about the life we'd built together, and my chest ached with the weight of it all. I'm leaving, I said finally, my voice steady. I'm taking the kids, and we're going to start over. Hannah's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. You can't just take them, she said, her voice rising. They're my children too. They deserve better than this, I said firmly. They deserve stability, a home where they're not caught in the middle of your mistakes. She opened her mouth to argue, but then closed it, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She knew I was right. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, I focused on the kids, shielding them as best I could from the fallout. I packed up our things, explaining to Emma and Jake that we were going on an adventure. We'll still see Mommy, I told them, my voice gentle. But for now, we need some time to figure things out. They didn't fully understand, but they trusted me. That trust was all I had left, and I was determined not to let them down. As for Jack, his bold arrogance had been reduced to silence. He was confined to a hospital bed, his leg in a cast, his alpha persona shattered. The police investigation lingered, but with the neighbors backing my account, it became clear I wasn't going to face charges. Jack had pushed too far, and the consequences were his to bear. Hannah stayed behind in the house, a shell of the woman I once knew. I didn't hate her, not anymore. What I felt was something closer to pity. She'd lost everything, not just me and the kids, but the life we'd built together. And for what? A man who had crumbled the moment he faced real adversity. I moved into a small rental with Emma and Jake, a modest place that lacked the charm of our old home but held the promise of a fresh start. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward, creating a life where my kids could thrive, free from the shadows of betrayal. Hannah tried to reach out a few times, sending long, apologetic messages that I couldn't bring myself to read. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and maybe I never would be. But I knew one thing for sure. I'd done what I had to do to protect my family, and I had no regrets. Jack, on the other hand, disappeared from our lives entirely. His arrogance had been his downfall, and he faded into the background as a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when you underestimate the power of a father protecting his own. And as I sat on the porch of our new home, watching Emma and Jake play in the yard, I realized that the peace I'd been searching for had finally found me. The night Jack was taken away in the ambulance felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The fallout didn't hit all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, as if the weight of what had happened needed time to settle. The first few days were quiet, almost eerie. Hannah stayed in the house, but the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and fear, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the explosive way I'd been before. What I felt now was colder, sharper, a determination to move forward without her. The kids adjusted to the changes quicker than I expected. Emma was too young to understand the depth of what had happened, and Jake, in his innocence, followed her lead. I made sure their routines stayed the same: school drop-offs, bedtime stories, Saturday morning pancakes. I wanted them to feel as little of the disruption as possible. Hannah tried to talk to me one evening after the kids had gone to bed. She stood in the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed over her chest, her face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I didn't look up from the papers I was reviewing for work. "About what?" Her voice faltered. "About everything." I set the papers down, finally meeting her gaze. "What's there to talk about, Hannah? You made your choices. Now we're living with the consequences." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I ruined everything, but I want to fix this. I want to make things right." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You don't get to decide that now. You had the chance to fix this weeks ago, Hannah. Instead, you kept lying. You kept seeing him." "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of losing everything. Scared of facing what I'd done. And look where that got us," I said coldly. "You didn't just lose me, Hannah. You lost us. The family we built, the trust we had. It's gone." She opened her mouth to respond, but I raised a hand, cutting her off. This isn't about me anymore. It's about Emma and Jake. They deserve better than this. Better than you and Jack sneaking around and tearing their world apart. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse under the weight of her own guilt. But I didn't soften. I couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Over the next week, I began the process of moving out. The rental house I'd found wasn't much, but it was enough. It had a small backyard where the kids could play and a cozy living room where we could start new traditions. It was a place to rebuild, away from the memories and the pain that clung to our old home. Hannah didn't fight me when I told her I was taking the kids. Maybe she knew it was futile. Maybe she understood that she'd already lost her standing as the stable parent. Whatever the reason, she simply nodded, tears streaming down her face as I packed up our things. The day we left was quiet. Emma hugged her mother tightly, confused but trusting me when I said we'd see her again soon. Jake clung to my leg, his little voice asking, "Daddy, why is Mommy sad?" I crouched down, ruffling his hair. "Mommy just needs some time to think," I said gently. "But we're going to be okay, buddy. I promise." And I meant it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, a clarity that had been missing for too long. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would do whatever it took to protect my kids and give them the stability they deserved. Jack, meanwhile, had disappeared. Word spread that he'd left town after his hospital discharge, his bravado and arrogance nowhere to be found. His name became a distant memory, a shadow of the chaos he'd caused. I didn't think about him much anymore. He wasn't worth it. Hannah stayed in the house, but her presence in our lives grew smaller and smaller. She called to check on the kids, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure she had the right. I kept our conversations brief, polite but distant. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. As the weeks turned into months, life began to feel normal again. The kids adjusted to the new house, and I threw myself into creating a safe, loving environment for them. Saturday mornings became pancake and cartoon time. Sunday afternoons were for trips to the park. Little by little, we built a new life together, one that felt lighter, freer. And me? I found peace in the quiet moments, the sound of Emma's laughter, the way Jake's hand fit perfectly in mine as we walked to the playground. I didn't need revenge or closure. I didn't need Hannah or Jack to admit they were wrong. All I needed was what I already had. My kids, my dignity, and the strength to keep moving forward. One evening, as I watched Emma and Jake chase fireflies in the backyard, I realized something. The betrayal that had once consumed me no longer had power over my life. It was a chapter, a painful one, but it didn't define my story. I'd taken control of my narrative, and I was writing a new one, filled with hope, resilience, and love. In the end, that was all that mattered. Hannah was no longer the center of my world. She became a lingering presence, a reminder of what was lost and the lessons learned, but no longer a figure shaping my daily life. The kids and I had settled into a routine at our new home, and though it wasn't easy, it felt right. It felt like progress. Emma and Jake adjusted faster than I expected. Kids are resilient in ways we often underestimate. Emma had taken to decorating her room with drawings and fairy lights, making it her own little sanctuary. Jake, ever the explorer, claimed the backyard as his kingdom, turning every patch of grass and tree stump into part of his grand adventure. Watching them find joy in the midst of upheaval gave me hope. Hannah tried to stay involved. She called regularly, her voice always tentative, as if she was testing the waters. She'd ask about the kids, about their school projects and little milestones, but the conversations never went beyond that. I kept it cordial, knowing it was best for Emma and Jake to have both parents in their lives, even if one of those parents had broken the trust that held us together. One Saturday morning, while flipping pancakes in the kitchen, Emma asked, "Daddy, do you miss Mommy?" The question caught me off guard. I set the spatula down and knelt to her level, looking into her wide, curious eyes. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" She shrugged, fiddling with the hem of her shirt. She looks sad when I talk to her, like she misses us. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I'll always care about your mom because she's your mom. But sometimes, even when people love each other, things don't work out the way they planned. Emma nodded slowly, processing my words. But you're not sad anymore? I smiled, pulling her into a hug. I'm not sad anymore, because I have you and Jake. You two make me the happiest dad in the world. Her smile returned, and she skipped off to set the table. Moments like that reminded me of why I made the decisions I did. My kids deserved stability, honesty, and love. And I was determined to give them all three. As for Jack, he was little more than a memory now. He disappeared from our lives completely after the incident, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of his arrogance. From what I heard through the grapevine, his business had taken a hit, and his reputation was in tatters. It wasn't revenge. I didn't care enough to seek that. It was simply the natural consequence of his actions. Hannah remained in the old house, a ghost of the life we once shared. She called less frequently as time went on, her attempts to reconnect growing weaker with each passing week. I didn't hate her anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by a quiet indifference. She was part of my past, but she didn't define my future. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching Emma and Jake play in the fading light, I reflected on how far we'd come. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it was all behind us now. In its place was a life I could be proud of, a life I had built from the ground up, brick by brick. The kids ran up to me, breathless and laughing, holding a jar of fireflies they'd caught in the backyard. "Look, Daddy," Jake said, his face glowing with excitement. "They're like little stars." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "They sure are, buddy." Emma climbed into my lap, holding the jar carefully. "Can we keep them forever?" I shook my head gently. Fireflies are meant to be free. They shine brightest when they're out in the world. She frowned, considering my words. "So, we let them go?" "We let them go," I said, "and we enjoy the time we had with them." Emma nodded, standing up and opening the jar. The fireflies floated out, their tiny lights blinking as they disappeared into the night. Jake clapped, cheering them on as if they could hear him. As I watched the fireflies fade into the darkness, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had my kids, my peace, and the strength to keep moving forward. And as Emma and Jake curled up beside me, their laughter filling the night air, I realized something important. Happiness isn't about holding on to what's broken. It's about letting go, rebuilding, and finding light in the places you least expect. In the end, that was enough.